So many thoughts. I have so many thoughts, many of which I haven't heard anyone else discuss, so strap in, because after what seems like a century of development, Disney's live action adaptation of The Little Mermaid has finally been released, and I watched it, and I have opinions. Opinions that I will be as objective and unbiased about as possible. Okay, first off, I want to begin by saying, as a self-labeled pretentious cinephile who falls asleep every night to French New Wave classics on the Criterion channel, I believe the general public's opinions on Disney live-action adaptations are incredibly lazy opinions. And it's ironic because the preconceived notions of every live-action adaptation that is announced is that the film itself is automatically lazy and unoriginal just because it's based on a pre-existing property, when Hollywood has always been using well-known stories and telling them over and over again. And the Walt Disney Company was actually built upon making films that were based on the most familiar stories and fairy tales known to man, so the complaint about movies being unoriginal is itself unoriginal and quite annoying. There's room for both original stories and familiar stories. All that matters is the approach, direction, and execution. And yes, plenty of these live-action adaptations have been lackluster, hollow imitations of the animated counterparts, but I don't think people understand that each live-action movie has a different filmmaking team, a different crew behind them, so they're not all going to be approached in the same exact way, and if you perceive these live-action adaptations as an attempt to replace the animated films, that's strange because Disney still embraces the animated versions of the characters and utilizes them to represent their company significantly more than the live actions. They clearly have no intentions of erasing the animated classics. It's quite clear to me that the live-action films are supposed to be celebratory companion pieces to the animated films that allow you to experience them in a different way. They coexist, side by side, and are intended to embrace the strengths of their respective mediums. They're not all successful, but be more open-minded. And also don't play dumb and pretend like you don't know why they're getting made. They make money, lots of it. Also, the one that actually took a significantly different approach from the animated film, Mulan, was the absolute worst. And the one that played it the safest, Cinderella, was arguably the best. Translating a beloved iconic animated film into a photorealistic, lifelike live-action world is not an easy task, especially when the entire world has expectations of what that should look like. Anyway, Little Mermaid. There is so much potential in bringing this story to life, using the iconography of the animated film as the jumping point, and incorporating the more mature, melancholic aspects of the original Hans Christian Andersen tale to create a sweeping fairy tale epic that provides new layers, emotional complexity, and depth. And this is not quite that, and it's not really fair to criticize a film based on what it isn't rather than what it is, but it is fair to say that this film consistently dodges opportunities for greatness. However, ultimately, it is a delightful experience, and I'm mostly happy with the final product. The major flaw for me is that director Rob Marshall is so hesitant to fully embrace fantasy, and he often limits the amount of extravagance in an attempt to come across as more grounded. And not only does that approach deprive us of some of the grand, imaginative, magical, breathtaking imagery that you'd expect from a live-action Little Mermaid, but it makes the campier, sillier elements feel out of place. And it makes some of the wonky CGI stand out a little bit more than it would if the film had established a more mystical fantasy atmosphere. And I'm not talking more cartoony or bright and colorful, because I expect a photorealistic world, and that's why, unlike a lot of people, I have no problem with the more grounded designs of the animals. I would have hated if they took the live-action Alvin and the Chipmunks Scooby-Doo route, because that would have just felt garish. That's the route that the live-action Pinocchio took, and it just cheapened the whole thing. So yeah, I like the more realistic animal designs, and they express enough emotion for me, far more than the 2019 Lion King. I really just think the film as a whole would have benefited from embracing being a fairy tale epic. A lifelike, photorealistic fairy tale epic, but a fairy tale epic nonetheless. Particularly the underwater world of the merfolk and Triton's kingdom are just so lackluster. Not only is the merfolk population mostly restricted to just Ariel's family, but there's a major lack of scope, scale, opulence, grandeur, wonder. Triton's palace is just a clump of boring rocks. If they wanted to go this direction, it could have been executed with much more cinematic flair, towering shapes covered in coral and marine life, but I definitely would have preferred a shining, sparkling castle in the vein of the animated film, and I think it'd be especially striking if it were made from a silky pearl texture or an iridescent shell substance. But yeah, the world of the merfolk is extremely lacking, especially when you think of similar underwater films like Aquaman, where the scope is massive and the designs are striking and imaginative, and that definitely has an impact on the overall feel of the film. The more grounded, stripped-down approach Rob Marshall goes for with The Little Mermaid would have worked a lot better if the technology on display was flawless, stunning, and groundbreaking, but it often looks iffy. Particularly when the merpeople are swimming, it looks a bit off. The movements of their top and bottom halves just don't tend to sync up, and probably would have looked a lot cleaner if they were mostly gliding through the water rather than vigorously flopping their tails, but it really wouldn't have been as big of a deal if the fantasy was amped up. So yeah, the CGI is not ever downright terrible, but it is noticeable and sometimes awkward. I've heard director Rob Marshall say in interviews that from the beginning they didn't ever want to lead with the technology. They wanted to prioritize the story, but listen, Rob, if the technology is not polished enough, then it just distracts from the story. Luckily it's not to an extreme degree here, but there should have been more focus on making the underwater visuals look pristine as possible, and honestly, for a film like this, should have aimed to push the boundaries of technology and CGI. They certainly had enough time to do so, considering production was delayed for over a year due to the pandemic. I don't see why they couldn't have taken the time to just sit down and think of ways to push this thing to greatness, because there truly was plenty of potential for them to create something magnificent. Now, I believe live-action adaptations should use the blueprint of their animated counterparts and greatly expand upon them and add more complex, humanistic layers to the film, really make use of the advantages of the more lifelike medium. Some of the other Disney live-action films like The Lion King and Pinocchio failed in that department, as they just regurgitated and replicated the animated films with very few additions, and those additions didn't provide any more depth or sophistication to the story and characters, so they actually did feel mostly pointless. They didn't understand the assignment of adapting a film into live action, and I particularly dislike when the majority of the dialogue in a live-action film is directly taken from the animated version, not just because it makes it feel too similar, but the dialogue that was created specifically for an animated movie, it operates on more an emotional than logical level, so it doesn't always translate well to a flesh and blood live-action world. The same can be said about specific moments from the animated films that only work within a more simplified, impressionistic realm. Live-action films need to take those elements from the animation and adjust them accordingly, flesh them out, rather than just directly plop them into a world they weren't designed for. A good example of where The Little Mermaid succeeds in that respect is in the Kiss the Girl scene when Eric is trying to guess Ariel's name. In the animation, he just starts guessing names and then eventually Sebastian whispers it in his ear and suddenly it comes to him. We totally buy that moment in the animation, but in a live action film, that would be a bit harder to swallow. It wouldn't translate well at all and would have us questioning the logistics of that moment in a way we had previously never had to think about. So, in the live action film, Eric is in the midst of teaching Ariel about the stars and constellations when he begins to guess her name, and she uses the constellation Aries as a jumping off point, and it's a really clever, cute moment that adds depth to both the characters, their relationship, and is exactly the type of more fleshed out alternative to an iconic moment that every scene should be approached with. And there are more of these types of moments here and there, but I wish they were a lot more prominent throughout the entire thing because, yeah, there are plenty of iconic lines and moments from the animation that can't be left out, but I wish most of them were approached in a way that was more unique to live action. Like, even though 2015 Cinderella was very faithful to the animated film and is probably the best Disney live action, I don't think it had a single piece of dialogue or a specific shot that was directly lifted from the animated version, because it was entirely approached through a more detailed, realistic live-action lens, and I think more of the live-action films should be like that. Where The Little Mermaid mostly expands upon the original and provides more depth is in Prince Eric and his relationship with Ariel. Those were some of the strongest moments in the film. I just really wish that same kind of depth and exploration was brought to the characters of King Triton, Ursula, and the Mer sisters, who particularly have a shockingly tiny amount of screen time considering so much of the film's merchandise includes them. And I don't care if the film's runtime is already 2 hours. If you want the more simplified, streamlined version of the story, watch the animation. Plus, there are some things that could have been cut in favor of more screen time for the underdeveloped characters. Eric's new song could have been cut. It's nothing special and doesn't add much, and the execution is kinda cheesy. The melody is nice, but the actor, who doesn't have a bad voice, doesn't really emphasize the melody, so it just sounds generic, and yeah, it could have been cut, or a duet with Ariel and Eric would have been nice. And Scuttlebutt was probably the only thing in the film that I found to be objectively bad. It just didn't work, and I was open-minded about it when I listened to it before the film, so yeah. Anyway, the way this film expands on the original is a lot more natural than the way Beauty and the Beast, for instance, did, with the random traveling book and the backstory of Belle's mother, and Belle inventing a washing machine, and all the other unnecessary stuff that amounted to nothing in the end. And Aladdin also sidetracked a bit with stuff like Jasmine's quest to be a sultan, so yeah, Little Mermaid's editions work much better than previous live actions, but I still wish the world and characters had been explored a bit more. Now, the singular element that significantly elevates the film is Halle Bailey as Ariel. She perfectly embodies the character that we all know and love and brings her to life flawlessly, but also adds an ethereal, siren-like quality that is so entrancing and captivating. Nobody else could have brought what she brings to the role, and especially with her heavenly singing voice, she just makes everyone's fan casts from a few years ago seem laughable, like Madeleine Pesch and Sophia Lillis and Sadie Sink could not have done this. So not only is Halle Bailey as Ariel hands down the most perfect casting Disney has ever done for a live-action film, but there's also an added bonus of socially resonant power in seeing a black woman be the one to most effectively portray a traditionally white character. Ariel is a major, iconic role to step into, and to see a person of color immaculately do so sends out the message that the shade of one's skin is not a limitation, which is such an important message to put into the world, as the history of representation of non-white people in film is absolutely atrocious, and you should look into it if you aren't aware. So yeah, regardless of the representation element, Halle Bailey's casting is absolute perfection. But I don't think many people, especially critics, are making note of just how revolutionary and important this film is in that respect. No matter what your opinion is on the film itself, and no matter how pointless or lazy you believe it to be, this casting is groundbreaking, and even since it was revealed back in 2019, it has already opened so many doors and so many minds as well, and if this wasn't a bold, revolutionary decision, it wouldn't have been met with so much controversy. Every revolution results in polarization because it challenges people to be more open. Anyway, yeah, she is truly the only choice for Ariel, but with that said, I don't think Rob Marshall and the rest of the filmmaking team fully deliver upon or support the vision of Halle Bailey as Ariel. The hair and makeup and costume departments in particular restrict her from fully living out her Disney princess moment. Though I love the idea of having loose strands of hair mixed in with her locks and a more natural ginger color in different shades instead of cherry red, the styling of her hair is just not doing her any favors. They're kinda doing her dirty a little bit. The flat middle part and the lack of volume just looks awkward, and I really don't know how in a major multi-million-dollar Disney project, this styling is what they went with. And before I had actually seen the film, based on the marketing, I also had my gripes about the lack of vibrancy in her hair, making her look less distinguishably Ariel, and therefore giving people more reason to point to her and say, that doesn't look like Ariel, but within the actual film, her hair is mostly vibrant and undeniably red. I don't know why in the shots cherry-picked for the trailers, her hair was so washed out and brownish. I don't know why those moments weren't corrected for the hair color to be more consistent with the rest of the film, but yeah, the color looks great most of the time. It's odd that that wasn't reflected in the marketing, but that doesn't mean they still didn't do her dirty with how she was styled in the actual film, which brings me to the costumes, or the lack of them. Look, I love the soft, dainty cottagecore vibes of the blue dress she wears throughout the film, but that's all she wears for 3 days. All the other live-action Disney princesses got new costumes in addition to all the ones from the animated films, but Ariel strangely gets less costume changes than she did in the animated version. No seafoam gown, no wedding dress, and most bafflingly, she never gets her main Disney Princess ball gown. She never gets her Disney Princess moment, which is sad, because think of all the potential of how magical Halle could have looked as Ariel in different costumes, which leads me back to Rob Marshall's tendency to limit the extravagance and fantasy. The iconic magical moment in the end of the animated film where Ariel emerges from the sea in a sparkling gown, I understand that it would be kind of strange to have King Triton suddenly become a fashion designer and give Ariel a new gown with her legs, but I'm sure they could have concocted something as equally striking and breathtaking rather than her just showing up in the blue dress again, but I can get over that. The absence of her main Disney princess look is a bit sad though. They don't include a dinner scene at the castle in this version, so you may argue there'd be nowhere to include the iconic gown, but they totally could have put it somewhere. I'm thinking after Ariel finds out about Eric's engagement to Vanessa and sings the second reprise of Part of Your World, It would be a very emotional moment if the maids dressed her in the pink gown for the engagement party as she suffers in silence, and the maids see that something is wrong, which would also give them more reason to side against Vanessa as they do when the animals start attacking her at the engagement party. And it's also just weird that they excluded Ariel from the engagement party in the first place and just kind of forgot about her, so yeah, that would have worked. But also, I think a dinner scene like the one in the original was necessary. The Queen and Ariel don't interact before the finale, so it would have benefited the story to see their dynamic and have the Queen be charmed by Ariel so that when the Queen accepts the Mer people in the end, it feels more natural and earned. I would have put the dinner scene after the Kiss the Girl sequence, and instead of Ariel and Eric arriving to the castle when everyone is asleep, I would have had them just be late for dinner. It would have definitely strengthened the film to have Ariel go to bed that night feeling accepted by the whole palace before everything is stripped away from her the next morning. But anyway, the Disney princess moment needed to be there for Halle to fully shine. Perhaps if the honeymoon dress had a bigger skirt, I would have accepted it as a stand-in for the main princess look, but moving on. Melissa McCarthy was strong in the role of Ursula, but she often couldn't find the balance between sinister and comedic. She sometimes strayed a little too campy, and it felt tonally off at points. Now, Rob Marshall has worked with Meryl Streep in a couple Disney projects in the past, so I would have definitely had her portray Ursula, as I think she would have had a much more grounded balance of intimidating and funny. But McCarthy is still good, she just doesn't knock it out of the park, and she frequently comes across as just reciting lines in a theatrical way rather than actually embodying the character. Also, her makeup is really bad and sloppy and lackluster. I would have done what they did with Angelina Jolie in Maleficent and give her fangs and prosthetic cheekbones and even a prosthetic nose to make it more angular and sharp and make it look like I'm not just looking at Melissa McCarthy. Everybody else did a fine job, even if I would have liked to see more of them. Daveed Diggs's Jamaican accent definitely didn't feel authentic, but he was ultimately solid, as were the other voice actors. I honestly thought Awkwafina was a fantastic Scuttle and was rightfully annoying and grating. You know, even if I thought the song Scuttlebutt was straight up bad. I have so many nitpicks with this film, but ultimately it's delightful, solidly made. There's nothing here that is just straight up bad, aside from Scuttlebutt. And Halle Bailey absolutely brings everything to a whole new level, and I'd love to see her play Ariel again, and this time be more supported by the filmmakers. I actually do think Disney should be venturing more into live-action sequels that expand upon the beloved characters and put them in new stories so that we can have our cake and eat it too. We can see iconic characters brought to life, but build upon their legacies and learn more about them and keep them alive and relevant without just regurgitating their stories, because even though, as I said, I am open-minded to live-action adaptations, I think everyone would be happier if we did new things with these characters. It's just weird that Disney has been establishing these characters in live action in stories we've already heard, and then never doing anything with them again. So yeah, I want more of Halle as Ariel because I like fun. So yeah, Halle as Ariel for life. Did I miss anything? I don't know, but those were my thoughts on The Little Mermaid, and I recommend you go out and see it because, yeah, it's a fun, harmless, enjoyable film, but I think the cultural implications are being overlooked because this film is major in that respect. I think it's very necessary for this film to succeed. So go out and see it, go out and support it. yeah. Um, Love you. Bye.